Very good evening, students. First and foremost, let me wish everybody as warmly as I possibly can passing through this absolutely unprecedented abnormal times, which has no precedence whatsoever. But at the same time, I just want to tell you that you need to be safe and not compromise on your health issues, and remain optimistic in life. This is a passing phase, and I understand the fact that many of you in fact have a lot of tension, but at the same time you also need to keep aware of the fact that this abnormality in fact is not going to be a lasting one. So this would continue for a while, no doubt, but then gradually again we would be back to normal. And therefore I don't really believe in this whole idea of the new normal, because I find it very abnormal, and something which is abnormal cannot be continued, or cannot continue rather, and cannot be turned into a permanent feature of our life. So I'm hopeful, and let us all be hopeful, that gradually again things will come back to normal, and you will again be back to the campus, get involved with the daily activities of your life, and take part in all that is normal for your time, for your age, in the genuine spirit of what I call the celebration of youth. And I wish you all the best in life. So I recognize the fact that these are tense times for you, but let me assure you once again that this is not going to be a very long drawn affair. I'm not saying that everything would be normal tomorrow, but I'm hopeful that within a reasonable span of time we would be able to again gradually get back to the life which I consider to be human and normal. So today I have decided, as many of you know, that I teach international relations at the Department of International Relations at Jadavpur University, and I also teach the undergrad program we have is in political science, so I also teach political science. So I have decided today to talk to you on a subject which interests me a great deal, and I think it is very what I would call relevant also, which is the nature of the international order in times of the pandemic. And I wish to broadly sort of look at what the nature of the international order is, dissect the idea of the international order as it prevails, and I'm also going to share some of my thoughts on what really are the contemporary challenges. In fact, the central argument which I would be making here is that I don't consider the pandemic to be changing the notion of the international order fundamentally. And by the way of my presentation at the talk rather, and this is going to be a kind of an informal talk, I'm not known to be somebody who in fact is very formal in terms of the presentations that I make, the lectures that I deliver. So in my conversational way, my whole idea in fact is to tell you that there are a great many continuities within the order, and given the fact that there are a great many continuities within the order, even a pandemic of this kind in fact should not be blown out of proportion and made into the basis of a claim that because of the pandemic the international order in fact is going to change. So I am of the opinion that that will not happen, although I must recognize that major perturbations and cogitations in fact are underway but they are underway for a long period of time. Okay, and this is something that I want to share with you. But before I start talking, I'm aware of the fact that this is a presentation which is not only meant for students of political science and international relations, but this is a general presentation that I'm making. So I would try my best to be as non-technical as I possibly can. But at the same time, I must tell you that I have always believed that, look, we are all formed by the disciplines that we study. And particularly a person of my age find it rather difficult, in fact, to suddenly transform and suddenly change into a mode, which is also partly a technical issue, but more than that, I think what is important is to recognize the fact that some of the issues that we would be discussing, they require a broad understanding, let's say, of certain concepts. They don't require a detailed understanding of concepts, and whatever is necessary, I will try in my limited way to explain to you, because I think that is going to make things much more easier for you. So I start by sort of making the argument that we have been living in an international order, particularly for the last, let's say, more than 70 years, from 1945 to be more precise, which is broadly described as the liberal international order. And what I intend to tell you, in fact, is that a significant part of today's talk, in fact, is about the nature of this international order. So what this international order, in fact, is about, what are its constitutive principles, what really are the nature of the challenges, in fact, which the international order faces, etc., etc. Okay. So this is broadly what we're going to talk about, and then we would move on to the nature of, I would say, power contestation, which is also related to the question of the international order, but it cannot be reduced to the nature of the international order. And then finally, I would also have some broad generic points to offer with regard to what I consider to be political and sociological aspects and issues related to the international order in these troubled times. Now, the first thing is this, that, look, I'm not getting into any prediction of where we would be moving. This is because of the fact that, look, in social sciences, and I take the science part to be significant, we have to be all the time aware of the fact that it is not easy to predict at all. And our predictions, in fact, are never event predictions. These are trend predictions, and obviously you understand the difference between the two. Trend predictions are about the broad configurations that you have, while events are, well, the regular day-to-day empirical happenings, which obviously would be impossible to predict. So a broad trend prediction, in fact, is certainly possible, and it has been made, sometimes accurately, sometimes inaccurately, but nonetheless trend prediction, in fact, happens. But let me bring this back again right at the outset, that because our disciplines, in fact, are not like the natural sciences, so even if we get the variables right, we put the right kind of weightage on them, and even if we are able to test these variables statistically in a number of cases, the accumulated result of these tests do not necessarily create advantages in terms of accurate predictions. Okay, in other words, they do not necessarily lead to accurate predictions, let's say. So therefore, we are not really going to predict as to what kind of a world we are going to ultimately get into. Okay, but we are going to broadly talk about the possibilities. So identifying possibilities is not exactly predicting the state of affairs. The second is that, look, when we use the term international order, we have to understand that, look, there is a difference between these terms we use, okay, a system and order. But sometimes the difference, in fact, is overblown. So we shouldn't really, I think, conflate the differences much. Very broadly speaking, the difference is this, that when you talk of an order, along with the functionalities and the operational parameters, you also include what is called the normative principles of the order. In fact, the normative principles, in fact, in many ways make it an order, okay, which is something more than the system. So an order is a system plus the normativity, or it's a system surplus concept. But every system, let me tell you, in fact has two parts to it. One is that there is a system-wide structural property of a system. This is difficult to configure because this is something that we do not see in the naked eye. Okay, like if you look at economics, for example, you have the market. Now the market is something which is not very concrete in terms of its empirics, okay, I mean, so it's not something which is right there. Similarly, if you look at the system, if you look at a system-wide component or the system-wide structure, let's say, it's something which is not empirically observed, or it is not something which is there, which is very easy to see, but nonetheless it's there. It's there because, a system is not necessarily reducible to the mathematical aggregation of its parts. So you can't just add up the values of the parts and get the value of the system. Okay, so the value of the system is more than the aggregation of its parts, the combination of its parts. So where does that surplus comes from? What is the source of the surplus? Now the surplus is actually the result of the interactions of both the units and the various other structural elements, or the process elements, in fact, which define a particular system. So these are sort of difficult to tie down, these are difficult to specify, but nevertheless, let me tell you something which is absolutely, I would say, absolutely relevant to the international order that we're looking at, which is that the international order, therefore, in fact, has these three parts. One is that a part of the international order, in fact, is the various units that make up the international order, and we all know that since the since the 19th century, and particularly since the 20th century, in fact, the most significant unit, in fact, the most dominant unit is the nation state. Okay, I mean, so we live in a statist international order. There are other actors, no doubt, and some of these actors are very powerful and influential actors, but they don't have what is called the critical property, okay, which only the states, in fact, have, which is sovereignty. Okay, the power to make binding, enforceable decisions. Okay, so that is the property which only the states, in fact, enjoy, and under normal circumstances, no other actor, in fact, would enjoy. Now, there are many dysfunctional states where you might see that certain groups, certain regimes, in fact, would possibly be able to exercise coercive, would be able to exercise coercion, coercive power more effectively than the authoritative allocation by the state. But those are exceptions to the rule. Okay, under normal circumstances, the state, in fact, is a kind of a social condensate, let's say, of violence. Okay, it's a legitimate sort of organization of social violence, as Max Weber, in fact, very famously, formulated. So the argument is that the first part of the international order, therefore, consists of these units, which are states mostly, but not exclusively. The second, in fact, is the system-wide structure, which is the international system structure, which is the result of these various complex combinations of interactions, rather, of the state and the various other process elements that we find within the system. And the third, in fact, would be a set of normative ideas and goals, without which an order in fact is impossible to conceptualize. You can't have an order without an element of normativity which is built into it. Now, if you look at the nature of the international order that we have, as I told you, that the nature of the international order is without any doubt, even now, and it has been for many, many years, the nature of the international order is the liberal international order. Okay, so let us have absolutely no what I would call no basic, let's say, sort of debate on that. So what is this order? So it is an open, loosely rule bound and a progressively oriented, what you call order. Now all of these in fact are contested, and some of you in fact might tear into this and say that, well, where are the rules, what progress are we talking about, and how much of it in fact is open. Now I would concede all those arguments and all those points, but by and large, if you look at the normative positioning of the system, then it is a system which is undoubtedly based on this kind of a broad commitment. Okay, it's an open, rule-based, progressive, flexible kind of a system. Now, the second point about the international order, which we need to be very, very, I think, which is very important, which we need to pay attention to, is the fact that this order in fact has been in the making for a long time. And when I say that it is in the making for a long time, what I mean is that essentially this order is the result of our responses to the various opportunities and challenges of modernity itself. And as we all know, that whether you were looking at capitalism or you were looking at industrial technology, these are invariable elements, let's say, of modernity at large. So you can't really dissociate these. Okay, you can't put them into separate boxes. I would in fact say that modernity in fact is the larger paradigm, and concepts like capitalism, which is an economic organization of life, or you have let's say democracy, which is a particular political organization of life. All these in fact are parts and aspects, let's say, of modernity as a whole. Okay, industrial technology, as I was telling you, and we all know what these many, I would say, opportunities and challenges in fact are. In fact, if you look closely historically and theoretically, then you find that for a considerable period of time, in fact, there was a parallel, what you call trajectory in liberalism and socialism, because both of these ideas in their own ways in fact are very much Enlightenment ideas. So in both liberalism and socialism, in fact, you have this robust confidence that humanity would be able to find solutions to their problem by ultimately prevailing on nature through the advancements in science and technology, which means through rationality and the progress of science. This is a broad belief that you find in virtually all the schools of liberalism and in many schools of socialism. The one exception, in fact, would be Western Marxism, but not all schools of Western Marxism, but definitely the more dominant schools of Western Marxism, which in fact, as we all know, gradually sort of became skeptical of this whole idea of prevailing, controlling, manipulating nature, in order to provide an anthropocentric solution, let's say, to the problems of mankind. But that is a separate issue. Let's not get into that right now. The idea, in fact, was that the convergence, in fact, was that compared to feudalism, capitalism, in fact, is a great advancement, or was a great advancement, because it liberated the factors of production, and it liberated, it in a manner in which was, at that point of time, unheard of, unprecedented. The difference between the liberal and the socialist projects, in fact, was that, according to the Marxists, the liberals, in fact, create conditions of, or capitalism creates conditions of abundance, but it fails to generalize this abundance, which means it cannot really distribute the fruits of abundance to everyone, because it retains the class appropriation of the surplus. So this is broadly the difference. Okay, but then this need not really engage us. Why I am saying this is because if you look at the nature of the international order which comes into being, the international order in fact is predicated on the ideas of modernity. Okay, they carry the tensions, the trials and tribulations of morality at large, and this is something that we need to understand and keep all the time in mind. And this, in a sense, creates certain limits to the transformations of the international order, okay, to which we would come later. Now, the third thing which I wish to tell you about the international order, in fact, is that we need to make a distinction here. And what is the distinction? The distinction, in fact, is that we need to differentiate between the constitutive principles of an order, any order. Okay, here we are talking about international order, but it could be any other order, and the constellation of power which inhabit that order. Okay, now there is often a tendency to conflate these two terms, which means there is often a tendency to read the former by the latter. I don't think that is a very wise thing to do, and I don't think that, academically speaking, that it is a legitimate exercise. So I would say that they are two different things. So if you look closely to the international order, the liberal international order which we have inherited and which we retain, which we operationalize, is basically predicated on three principles. First is the idea of national sovereignty. Now you all know what the idea of national sovereignty is. I don't need to, in a way, get into that at all. It's about a certain territorial organization of space within which there is a supreme authority which is hierarchically organized and which has the capacity, in fact, to maintain rule-based, maintain a rule-based system, so that the other basic principles, the other basic activities of life, in fact, can take place. Okay, so if you go back and look at the classical texts of political philosophy, you find that Hobbes, in fact, was largely making the point that you can't explain the making of the state or the creation of sovereignty as the defining principle of the state by only focusing at the innate rationality of the human being. So the basis of the state is not only reason, but it is more than reason, it is fear. Okay, I mean, so it's the fear that unless there is an authority which regulates and constrains us, we would be pushed back into an extremely undesirable and violent anarchical life, which in fact would not be desirable at all. Okay, and therefore authority sort of comes in. So that's sovereignty. The second aspect of the international system that we have, in fact, is what is called rule-based multilateralism. Okay, now rule-based multilateralism broadly means that while the international order is predicated on the principle of national sovereignty, we must realize the fact that states are not consumed in violence. Okay, I mean, it's the daily activities of the states. If you look at it, the daily activities of the state, in fact, is not violent. Okay, even if you look at the classical European period when there was a lot of war, there was this understanding, for example, that war in fact is an aberration. So war in fact is not the norm. Okay, so the peace in fact is the norm, and war in fact is the violation of that normality. Okay, I mean, so when things come apart, as the forces of destruction in fact increased, got more and more destructive, the longevity of war gradually became shortened. Okay, I mean, the First World War and the Second World War, in fact, were terrible wars, absolutely, in terms of their, scale of devastation. But if you look at the time, the period, then obviously these are shorter wars compared to the other historical wars that you can look at. Okay, I mean, and I'm not pushing you far back into history. So even if you look at the post-Westphalian period, okay, I mean the period between the Treaty of Augsburg and the Treaty of Westphalia is critical, because it is within this period that the classical elements, let's say, of the modern state, they took root in the European continent. Okay, now the ubiquity of the statist system is obviously not a 19th century phenomenon. As you all know, it's a 20th century phenomenon. It is the result of waves of decolonization, which gradually led to the universalization, let's say, of the state form. What is significant here is this, that while it had led to the universalization of the state form, the classical element of the state, they in a way in fact have been formed in that period between the Treaty of Augsburg and the Treaty of Westphalia, which resulted in the Westphalian state. So don't jump to the conclusion that we still live in the classical Westphalian state. There is no one state form, by the way. Okay, there are various kinds of state forms. But what is critical, what we have to understand is that we live in a society of states. Okay, so you can't escape the state in any way. And given the fact that we live in the society of states, and states, in fact, because of the fact that there is no overriding authority in the international system, there is no supra-sovereign who would be able to control these states. So as a result, I mean, there is every possibility that there might be a lot of violence in the international system, but actually there is not such violence. Now this is because of what is known as the multilateralism, okay, a broad rule-based kind of a system, which is a kind of, let's say, a cooperative scheme of generalized existence, which in fact has given rise to facilities like the international law, facilities like global institutions, and a global civil society, okay, with various kinds of structures and various kinds of processes. So the idea therefore is this, that the multilateralism that we witness, in fact, is a generalized system of conducting day-to-day business of a very complex international life. Now, these attest to international political economy, these attest to strategic affairs, these attest to a whole range of what you call service related activities and commercial activities, a whole lot of other civil, societal and cultural activities of life. Okay, so these activities, in fact, they take place, they do not attract attention because they're not necessarily very glamorous. Okay, I mean, so when a war takes place or a conflict takes place, the media glare is immediately onto it. Okay, and we live in this kind of a sensationalized kind of a world where the daily activities, in fact, which actually keep us going, they fade into the background. Okay, I mean, it's the more the aberration which is advertised, which becomes larger than life, and they seem to be hogging the limelight all the time. But that doesn't mean that the daily activities are absent. In fact, these daily activities are, in a sense, they're present. They're always sort of happening. They're granular. They move slowly. Sometimes they evolve in slow motion kind of thing, but they happen nonetheless. And the third element, in fact, is that the liberal international order is an kind of an open trading system, which is committed to the principle of the free market. Okay, now historically, again, there is a great amount of variation in the nature of this commitment, to what extent there was a free market, to what extent there is a free market, whether this commitment in fact is a progressive commitment or is it a regressive commitment. Now, I'm not going into those normative issues here, but the fact of the matter is that if you empirically look at the elements, then these are the elements. So these are the constitutive elements, let's say, the constitutive principles of the international order. The power constellation of an international order, on the other hand, consists of how many powers dominate the international system. You get the point. I would here make that distinction between the international order and the international system. But it's not a cast iron distinction. So even if you use one as a synonym of the other, you are not making any cardinal error of any kind. Okay, I mean, so in other words, the constellation of powers is essentially a mathematics of how many powerful states exist within a given order or a given system. And we generally tend to measure this by the polarity of this system, which means that how many poles exist. So if you have two poles, we have a bipolar order, and each of these poles in fact is capable of inflicting unacceptable damage on the other. If you have a number of poles that in fact are able to deter each other, then you have a multipolar system. Okay, and if you have one pole, you get into a hegemonic system where the global power, which could very well be a planetary power, in fact is so superior in terms of overall capabilities, particularly the geostrategic and economic capabilities and capabilities of science, technology, research, that they are able to project power almost sort of infinitely, okay, anywhere, in any theater. But they do not suffer from any kind of reciprocal, what you call projection. They don't suffer from that. Okay, I mean, so therefore they constrain others, but they are not necessarily likewise constrained. Okay, so that's the unipolar system that you have. Now the point that I'm making is, and this is important, the point that I'm making is that we should not confuse the change in the constellation of powers, which means when the order in fact is changing in terms of distribution of power, with the fundamental change in the constitutive principles of the order. Okay, and a system change or the nature of an international order, in fact, in true sense of the term, will change only when the constitutive principles in fact change. In other words, we are obsessed with the power change within, and we don't pay sufficient attention to the underlying principles. I want this to be corrected. I want more attention to be paid on the underlying principles. What is happening to these underlying principles? How are they evolving? What are the challenges they are encountering? Rather than a mechanical reading of an international order by only looking at how powers in fact shift from one epoch to the other. Now let me make one thing very clear, and don't get me wrong here. I'm not undermining the value of the power change. What I am suggesting is that the power change is only one aspect of the international system, and a lot of power changes can actually take place without breaking up the system, without fundamentally altering the system. That is the point that I'm trying to get across, and I hope I've been able to get across. Okay, so what I'm saying is that powers might change, the international order may not change. Okay, the reverse is historically, I think, very difficult to, imagine, where the principles would change without a change in the constellation of powers. Okay, so if you are looking in terms of the causality, the causal primacy in fact lies with the power configuration. So the nature of the power in fact would largely decide what kind of principles in fact they come to define the system. But once defined, these principles acquire a life of their own. They are not entirely determined, fully determined by the dominant powers. Even the most dominant power in fact will not be able to completely, let's say, decide the longevity or the life of these principles. Okay, so I hope I've been able to make this very, very clear to you. Now, if you look at the liberal international order that exists, I'm going to broadly make 2-3 points here. The first point is this, that in a sense, if you are looking at this order in fact this order started a long time back. When did the order started to take place? The order in fact started taking place during the interwar period. Okay, now in the interwar period, in fact, there are two kinds of interpretations here. One is the Karl Polanyi kind of a moment, and the other is the H. Carr kind of a moment, and one needs to in a way differentiate the one from the other. Polanyi was broadly in a way drawing attention to the changes in the nature of the organization of capitalism and the cogitations within capitalism, in fact, which was changing the nature of capitalism. And once the nature of capitalism in fact was changing, the political organization in fact of the capitalist system would also naturally undergo a change. Carr, on the other hand, was drawing attention to the inevitability of great war politics as a defining element of an international order. So he didn't really believe that a liberal international order in fact had a life of its own. He believed that every order in fact is ultimately the creation of powers who dominate a particular system. Now the argument in fact is this, that if you look at the interwar period, the interwar idea of liberal internationalism in fact was this, that there is a lot of war between states, primarily because of the fact that states in fact states are unable to evolve a constitutional order which in fact would negotiate relations between them. Do you get the point? In other words, much of this imagination in fact is a post French Revolution and American Revolution, what you call imagination. So a lot of emphasis on constitutionalism, a lot of emphasis on democracy, but this is more a republican form of democracy, okay, not the feisty mass-based democracies of our times. So the idea in fact was that, look, in many ways, in many cases, there was a lot of violence in the international system because there were many authoritarian states who did not care for the losses that people suffered in times of war. So unaccountable, okay? They're not democratic political systems. So even if you suffer enormous amount of let's say casualties in a war and loss of property, an authoritarian system in fact might still not give up power, and there may not be any political crisis which removes this authoritarian political system. And the second argument in fact which was made was that the tendency in fact to build order through balance of power was problematic because there was no concrete understanding or definition of how the balance in fact is going to work. As a result, in fact, there was a lot of emphasis given on secret diplomacy, a lot of emphasis given on the fact that diplomacy in fact is very high end and therefore must be obscured in secrecy, and therefore it should not really be open to democracy at all. Okay, I mean, so it's a space which is not a democratic space. It's not a space which is a kind of, let's say, a communicative space. And this is justified by the Reza Dehta, argument, reasons of state. Now, the liberal internationalists were therefore broadly making the argument that these in fact would have to change. So in a Kantian sense, they were making the argument that if democracy in fact became the dominant ethos, if states became democratic, they are not going to make war against each other, because democratic systems in fact are peaceful systems. And if we can move from a balance of power to a collective security system, then we would in a sense in fact have a better and a more reliable cooperative security arrangement, which in fact is going to work far effectively than the indeterminate and risky balance of power. Now, historically, none of these predictions came true. I'm not going into that. Fascism, as you know, came through through democratic political systems, both in Italy and in Germany. and the League of Nations, in fact, which was the first experiment in collective security, was a massive failure. Okay, but let's not go into that. What I'm trying to tell you is this: that look, the first generation liberal internationalism, which in fact a part of it gets into the post 1945, and this point needs to be emphasized, that the post 1945 order is not entirely new. There are many new elements into it. The institutions are new. But again, if you look at the norms, if you look at the principles, these norms and principles are inheritances of the past. So what in fact is happening here is this, that if you look into the past, you find a kind of what in the Wilsonian liberalism, which wasn't really, in a sense, very progressive enough, because it was not talking about freedom to the colonies. And it was broadly talking about a system which would be managed by the dominant Western powers. But in the post-1945 period, what we find in fact is that this liberalism in fact becomes far more, in a sense, far more inclusive. And its commitment to democracy, deepens. And not only does its commitment to democracy deepens, but it also becomes more vocal, let's say, about rights of people. And it also begins to talk of a lot of, institution building, and begins to talk of investing in multilateral institutions for the better management of the international system. So, in the post-1945 period, the multilateralism that we have, in fact, and this is a critical point which we need to understand, is what is called by Eikenberry as one-half multilateralism or half multilateralism, in a sense that this is a multilateralism which in fact took shape basically through the aegis of the United States, the West European countries like France, like Germany, like Britain, like Italy, like Holland and others, Spain and others, and Japan. So it was a cohesive group of countries who in fact had a lot of economic and political convergence at that particular point of time. And they were in a sense able to create a geopolitical imagination with a template which they began to call liberal internationalism. So in a sense, there was this broader geopolitical imagination to this liberal international order, and that broader geopolitical, I would say, imagination was that the world order, in fact, must be decided and dominated by these powers. In sharp contrast, if you look at the other pole, if you look at the Soviet Union and the states that in fact were close to the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc of countries, and for a long period of time China, they remain completely outside the system. And so this is a critical point in terms of a concept which is called dynamic density, which basically means that you have to look at these international orders in terms of how much transaction takes place. So what is the load into the system? How much communication takes place? How much functional cooperation, bargaining? How much of common agenda setting takes place? So if you are looking at these factors, for example, then what you see is that each epoch in fact would have its own quotient of dynamic density. So if you are looking at the Cold War, as I've just explained to you, that in the Cold War, the two, the two blocks were largely separated from each other. They did not share a common world view, and they were not committed to similar principles. So as a result, what we find in fact is that the dynamic density of the system in fact was less. And if you look at the third world, which in fact gradually got independent, many of them in fact would remain non-aligned. But in a genuine sense of the term, what you find in fact is that some of them would be leaning on the West, some of them would be leaning on the Soviet countries. But in terms of their own communication, in terms of their own, let's say interstate trade and other figures, again the dynamic density in fact was not very high. So there were technological constraints, there were also political constraints of various kinds, as a result of which you had that kind of a system. When you come to the post Cold War period, there is a fundamental transformation that is happening. Now the transformations are the following. The first thing that happens is this, that this system, which is the liberal international system, which in fact was a cohesive system of a small number of states which were largely committed to similar political and economic values and orientations, that got upended into a global system for the first time. In other words, this is the time, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the socialist states, this is for the first time that the entire international system genuinely becomes a liberal international system, at least in terms of participation, at least in terms of engagement, at least at least in terms of, in a sense, agreeing to the rules of the game. So this is the tipping point, let's say, that happens. But the moment that happened, problems begin to emerge. The first problem, in fact, is, I've already indicated that, and if you have followed, that look, earlier there was a sense of cohesiveness, there was a kind of tightness within the international order. There was a recognition, let's say, of the leadership role that the United States played, and there was a kind of, let's say, more effective management of the differences that would emerge from time to time within the group. But as the system became a global system, fundamental changes, in fact, began to take place. One, the system is now joined by a variety of states, many different kinds of states at various levels of social political development, various kinds of economic systems, various kinds of regimes with their own obligations, with their own peculiar ideologies. And once they all came together, inevitably the earlier consensus, in fact, was lost. And as a result, you see, everything came to hang in the balance, let's say. In other words, the whole question, in fact, was now, who is going to provide leadership? Why would that particular state be accepted as the leader? Okay, so what is the social capital that particular state, in fact, possesses? A question which, in fact, has not been asked in the Cold War period. Who will share the cost? How the cost sharing arrangement, in fact, is going to work out? What about intergenerational justice? So many of these questions, in fact, they began to fray the margins of the liberal international order as never before. Okay, so this is an enormous amount of strain that we are looking at. The second argument is even more critical in many ways, which is that, look, if you look closely to the Cold War period, and that is also the most successful period of the liberal international order, now the success was not only the success of a kind of a strategic geopolitical equipoise that existed amongst the three group of states that I have already talked about, but it was also largely because of the fact that the multilateral order evolved as a security community of sorts. Now this security community, in fact, is not a security community in the conventional sense of the term. In other words, that this is a security community which doesn't really talk about peaceful, I would say, settlement of all disputes short of war and violence. It did talk about that, but it's not really something which was central. This security community, in fact, is largely a question of a social security arrangement, which basically provided a much needed balance between the leverage allowed to the free market forces on the one hand and the economic protection that the lesser classes, in fact, they demanded on the other. In other words, this is also the period, if you look at the Cold War period until 1980s, so from 45 to 80, if you look at that, the post-80 period, in fact, is the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, and the economic models begins to change. The economic model begins to change. Now, if you look at the period from 45 to roughly 80, this is the period when the welfare state in fact was at its height. And if you look closely to the welfare state, it is here that John Gerard Ruggie, a very famous constructivist scholar of international politics and somebody who's worked extensively on United Nations and multilateralism, he in fact refers to the concept of embedded liberalism, which is an idea which says that liberalism for its success had to be socially had to socially embed itself. Okay, I mean, so the success of liberal capitalism in fact was its social embeddedness, which basically meant that it was able to create a social compact between capital on one hand and the other classes in society on the other. Now, how they were able to create the social compact is again a very complex, but very interesting story, and I'm not going to go into that. I'll just in a nugget sort of share, and many of us in fact they know this. Is this that, look, if you are looking at the Western countries and the Western, what you call capitalist liberal democracies, there's always been this tussle between two rival principles of organization, or it's a kind of a bifurcated commitment. One part of the commitment in fact is towards what is called the accumulation of capital, which means that the economy in fact must not only be in private hands, but the private entrepreneurs in fact must make sufficient profit, so that the economy in fact, the health of the economy in fact remains very, very good all the time. But at the same time, and this involves what? This involves not only a lot of concessions being given to the industrialists and the entrepreneurs, but it also involves a lot of activities on part of the state on behalf of the capitalists. Okay, laying the infrastructure, investing in science and technology. Okay, creating strong institutions, maintaining a rule-based order, everything that a profitable economy in fact requires. But at the same time, one also needs to understand and keep this in mind, that these countries in fact were democracies, and their democracy was gradually, the democratic element in fact was gradually on the up. Okay, in other words, the role of the common people in fact they were getting stronger by the day. And what it entailed is basically that along with the commitment to the accumulation of capital, the state also had to commit itself to a legitimation principle, which is the subject of Habermas's very famous book, The Legitimation Crisis, which broadly says that the state in fact had to somehow guarantee that many of the deficiencies and the shortcomings of capitalism could be elevated by the state. Okay, could be elevated by the state, could be in a way provided through the aegis of the state. And this is where welfare obviously came in. Now, the obvious contradiction in fact was glaring, because the commitment to accumulation basically sort of involved that taxes in fact would never be too high, and on the other hand the increasing demand on welfare constantly sort of pushed states in fact to tax more and more, okay, because they needed more money for welfare. So in a sense there was this crisis built into the social compact, okay, and every democratic welfare state in fact had done a very complex tightrope walking, creating trade-offs which in fact would be moving, sometimes giving more concessions to the market and to the entrepreneurs, sometimes leaning on welfare. But on the whole, what in fact was happening is the fact, what in fact was happening in fact was the fact that there was this delicate balance between capital on one hand and welfare on the other. Now, in the post-Cold War period, what we find in fact is the gradual unfurling, let's say, or the coming off of the social contract. Why did this come off? What went wrong? Okay, the reason why, I mean, the reason why it came off, in fact, is because of the Thatcherite and the Reaganite policies, let's say, which came into being from the 80s, which began to lean very much, let's say, on the on free market forces, on privatization and liberalization, let's say, and increasingly saw welfare as economically unviable. Okay, and because of the overall weakening of labor politics around that time, there wasn't really very strong political opposition to these moves. And as a result, what we find, in fact, is that over a period of time, this social compact which existed, embedded liberalism, in fact, in Ruggie's terms, they became extremely unviable, okay, very, very difficult to maintain, and in many states, it simply, started to come off. Now, the third thing which I would draw your attention to is that the end of the Cold War is not only a shift from the bipolar to the unipolar, kind of a system. The end of the Cold War also sees the onset of globalization and an unprecedented, I would say, development of technology. And this unprecedented development of electronic technology meant what it meant, that there was this enormous increase in dynamic density. All kinds of communication, in fact, became increased many times. Okay, and it became a kind of an intermeshing which the world, in fact, had never really sort of seen. And you can't really imagine what was happening in the early days of globalization by only looking at trade statistics, because trade is only one aspect of globalization. Much of globalization, in fact, is in the effects of globalization. In fact, they were more sociological in nature. Okay, I mean, they were felt in the spheres of culture. They were felt in the realm of political values. They were also obviously felt in the ways in which people, in fact, conducted business. The enormous, salience of services in the entire hierarchy of economic function. So all these things, in fact, they gradually became important in life as never before. And this created enormous strain on the existing, liberal international order, because the existing international order, in fact, was materially, institutionally underprepared to respond to this kind of a challenge. Okay, I mean, in other words, this order, in fact, had not really invested enough in creating institutions and in creating principles, ways of doing things, which in fact would take care of some of these, new social forces, some of these new technological forces, some of these new economic, I would say, policies and economic structures, whose consequences could not be predicted, and whose consequences, in fact, could not be anticipated, predicted, and controlled over a relatively short period of time. So a lot of focus, in fact, in the literature on globalization goes into states losing their economic capability, the dilution of sovereignty, autonomy, etc., etc. But the major impact of globalization, in fact, had been in eroding the fundamentals of the liberal international order, which is paradoxical, because this was a great moment of success of the liberal international order. But success may create this enormity of expectation, and it may create situations of overloading, where institutions and practices, in fact, do not come up in quick time to be able to take the load and to be able to transact business in an effective manner. And this is precisely what in fact happened. And as we see the subprime crisis, which led to the recession of 2007, 2008, 2009, around that time, particularly 2008 and 2009, that in fact was in a sense an absolutely debilitating experience, because it completely, exposed the weakness of the liberal international order to do something as a kind of a deterrent. Okay, it obviously couldn't deter, but it also failed largely, in fact, to come up with any systemic solution to a problem of this kind. So, if you look at the solution in fact again sort of brought in the importance of the state, the regulatory devices of the state. Finally, if you look at the changes that we are talking about, the final change that I draw your attention to, and these are not unrelated to each other, so please bear that in mind, is that we also witness the emergence of a whole set of issues whose scale was not coterminous with the territorial boundary of the nation state. In other words, the success of the liberal international order, despite its commitment to the market, which is a non-territorial organization or an institution, was largely because of the fact that states in fact were able to work out bargains, states were able to create convergences, states were able to strike negotiations, and states were able to settle most of the problems in fact that they faced in their regular life. Okay, maybe I should qualify and say that not most of the problems, but many of the problems. But increasingly what we find as we go into the post-Cold War era and we move into the 21st century, that we are confronted with global problems and global threats, be it environment and climate related, or be it health, pandemics and health issues, or be it currency, related, currency and speculation related problems, or terrorism, or huge refugee influx, problems which could not be configured within the territorial cartography of the nation state. But at the same time, our political imagination in fact is almost entirely monopolized by the ontological dominance of the nation state. Okay, so our thinking of political space in fact is so heavily nation state oriented that when confronted with problems which are not coterminous with boundaries of the nation states, which you cannot contain within the boundaries of the nation states, our solutions in fact had not been able to go beyond this nation state thing. In other words, we have not been able to create institutions and practices that in fact would genuinely operate at levels higher than and at scales that are different from the nation state. As a result of these, the international order that we have been inhabiting in fact had been undergoing a kind of crisis. It is a crisis of constitutive principles, not of national sovereignty so much, but definitely a crisis of multilateralism, because the general rules that we have, these rules in fact they fall short in many ways. I have already discussed them. And also a crisis in terms of the openness of the system. Okay, and because of this, what we find is that increasingly the system in fact has tended to be more and more, I would say anti-open, more and more closed as a result of this. Now this leads me to another point which I think I need to add here, which is to draw your attention to what? To draw your attention to the fulcrum of the liberal international order. And the fulcrum of the liberal international order in fact had been, as I had already told, and Attenberry and others and Kupchan and others in fact have very clearly made this out, that it's basically been the United States led international order consisting of West Europe and Japan. So that's the group of states that we are looking at. So if you look at these states, not only do we find that we are confronted with many kinds of developments that happen from outside these group of countries, But if you look closely at these states also undergo transformations that become, or that gradually became, challenges for the international system that they have developed. Many of these problems, in fact, were the results of factors like economic slowdown, unresolved social tensions, the breakup of the social contract that I was talking about, and also the fact that the dynamism of these countries, okay, they had been on a kind of a secular decline, okay, so they were losing on their dynamism as well. So the result of this, in fact, is that the democratic designs of these systems, the democratic, I would say, the democratic political capital of these systems, if you are looking closely, the nature of democracy, let me make it very, very clear. In fact, they began to work, they began to encounter challenges, they began to encounter problems. So if you look at West Europe, for example, you find what? You find the rise of the political right. You find the rise of xenophobic ultranationalist forces, increasing, I would say, mobilization on closures, on borders, on controlling the movement of people from one place to the other, increasing attention to the notion of the stranger, the other, the adversary, and the tendency to securitize, let's say, demography for the first time. Not possibly for the first time, but once again, in a new garb, in a new sense. Similarly, if you look at the United States also, you find that, the fundamental differences in the US, for example, which had always been there, these fundamental differences, in fact, they gradually deepen. And as a result, in fact, you have progressive, forces, liberal, progressive, pro-socialist forces in the US. And on the other hand, deeply conservative, okay, including a large number of blue-collar, American workers, who found that because of the cheap, technology and low wages in China and many other, third world countries, their, economic fortunes, in fact, were plummeting very rapidly. They begin to lose jobs. And there is a kind of deindustrialization that takes place in many areas of the United States, as a result of which, again, nationalistic, protectionist, conservative political leadership, in fact, they started to grow. Now, these, to my mind, they pose a completely different kind of a challenge to the international order. Because if these political forces, they come to dominate, they would have no interest in maintaining this present international order. Because if you look closely to the features of the international order, and I'll just come in a minute on the features of the international order, they are not really interested in maintaining these features of the international order, because they don't think that these elements or these attributes, in fact, they contribute to the strength of their nation state. Hence, a major threat to the present international order, in fact, inhere in the domestic political tendencies of the very arc of stability that, in fact, had generated the very basis of the liberal international order and sustained it for a length of time. So, in simple terms, what I am trying to tell you is this, that for a long period of time, the countries that, in fact, had been able to operate the liberal international order with a reasonable degree of success were able to do this because they were liberal states, they were democratic states, and they were not ultranationalist, xenophobic political formations. Don't come to the conclusions that they were saintly, what you call political systems, by no means, but definitely they were more regular political forces in comparison with the kind of political forces that, in fact, have become more and more visible in recent years. So therefore, if I sum up, what really are the features of the international order that we are looking at, the multilateral international order or the liberal international order? Broadly, these are the features that one can identify. The first of these, in fact, is a commitment to free trade. Okay. Broadly, the argument being that if economic exchanges, in fact, are not mediated through nationalism and they are not affected by protectionist policies, then free exchange would benefit everybody. So it would be beneficial for all states, for all stakeholders in the final analysis. The second element, in fact, is that it's committed to what is called rule-based multilateralism. I've already discussed that. It's about maintaining the system by means of building in resilience into the system, investing in the systemic qualities of the system so that it's able to become more predictable over a period of time. Building institutions, and once you build institutions, institutions, they make transactions more transparent, and if transactions become transparent, then it becomes less costly. If it becomes less costly, then the extractive capacity of the state, in fact, need not be very high, and the state, in fact, will be efficient with relatively low extractive capacity, which would strengthen democratic political systems also. Then the next feature, in fact, is what is broadly called a kind of commitment to change. Okay, in other words, as I can barely say, that the liberal international order, all liberal international orders, in fact, and they are different from other orders because they consider the order to be corrigible, which means that the order, in fact, is subject to change. We can't come to the conclusion that all change is necessarily positive, all change is necessarily good, but there is a generic commitment to the principle of change. So we need to make this distinction between a principle which is normatively agnostic to the nature of change and a principle which is broadly teleological in nature. So if a principle is broadly agnostic to the nature of change, which means that it has a natural predisposition to experiment because it's not afraid of the end product of the experiment, so what might come out of it. But on the other hand, if the commitment is teleological, then every change, in fact, would have to willy-nilly be turned towards a given goal, a given finality. Okay, so the international order which we inherited and which we function less efficiently than before is broadly one which is corrigible in nature. And the final element, in fact, is that this is an international order which is committed to values like liberty, like equality of opportunity, like distributive justice, like a certain balance between wealth on one hand and social justice on the other, and a broad, I would say a broad-based multiculturalism, which in fact would create a balance between cultural choices, free cultural choices on one hand, and the demands of indigeneity and demands of identity on the other. So these are broadly, let's say, the features of the international order which we have inherited. And on many of these issues, in fact, we find cogitations and we find challenges. And in many of these things, some of these challenges, in fact, have increased over a period of time, and the pandemic obviously, in fact, complicates matters to some extent. But these are, if you look at these features, in fact, are long set features. And the challenges to these features, in fact, they are also procedural in nature. And the end result of what is going to happen to the system will therefore depend on how the system responds to these challenges over a period of time, to these principles that we have been talking about. Two final points. First, while we have said a lot about the international order, we also need to say something about the constellation of powers, and it is here that the rise of China, in fact, becomes a moot point. But I don't wish to here speak on the rise of China, because you see, if you look at the history of the rise and fall of great powers, it is inevitable that hegemonic powers, in fact, rise and they fall, and new powers, in fact, they take their place. So there is nothing unique about the rise of China. What is significant about the rise of China at this stage, in fact, is that if you look closely, the Chinese system, in fact, is something which is in many ways the bone of contention here. And I'm not going to make any normative comment about the rightness or the wrongness of the Chinese political system. What I'm going to broadly say is this, that if you look at the Chinese political system, one thing is very clear, that the system, its fundamental commitment, in fact, is not to any ideological dogma, but its fundamental commitment, in fact, is to the preservation of the hierarchical system. Okay, so whatever the organizing principle is, the preservation of the system, in fact, is what is critically important. Now, what is significant is this, that look, there is a body of theory which broadly sort of says that hegemonic powers, they rise and fall because of sustained domestic economic growth. And China obviously qualifies on this. I mean, they had experienced sustained economic growth for a long period of time. There is a lot of debate on what exactly is the nature of the Chinese economy, because as we know, credible information is a problem with China. But the fact of the matter is that the Chinese, in fact, have rapidly come up, and the United States and the Western powers, in fact, have downgraded. Now, as a result of this, and in line with the activities of all great powers in the past, the Chinese, in fact, they have become more assertive. And as a result, what we find is this, that on the one hand, they are asserting in areas like East Asia, for example, which they consider to be their legitimate sphere of interest. And second, they are trying their level best, in fact, to use supply chains and other economic instrumentalities so that the resource-rich, critical spaces of the world, in fact, they increasingly come under Chinese control, under their influence. Now, how this is going to ultimately pan out in terms of the system, that's something which one would have to closely look. Why I say this is because that the theory also says that while hegemonic powers, in fact, will rise and fall, there is no necessary or inevitable conclusion that this transition, in fact, will have to be bloody, or this transition, in fact, will have to be through a system defining, system shaping, system altering war. It need not necessarily happen. It need not necessarily happen because if the challenger, which ultimately, in fact, would possibly become a hegemon or the dominant power, if it accepts to play by the rules of the game, then the prospect of a bloody transformation, in fact, is reduced substantially. And I draw your attention to some of the basic facts here. That look, China has been increasingly drawn into the global system over the last 20 years. So it's become a part of the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and it largely plays by the rules of the liberal economic order. Okay, I mean, obviously, its trade surpluses, its unfair intellectual property, piracies and other practices, in fact, those are there. But by and large, if you look at the system through which it plays, the system, in fact, is the one which, in fact, has been put in place by the Western powers, and China, in fact, had gradually gravitated into the system. Now, if the United States, in particular, decides to abandon that system, it doesn't necessarily follow that China, in fact, would radically alter the system. It might simply take it over. Okay, so the Americans, in fact, they withdraw, and the Chinese, in fact, they simply come and occupy the space. Now, how would they run the system, given the fact that the Chinese political culture is very different from the American political, the Western or the liberal democratic political culture? Again, is something which is difficult to predict, because there is empirical data on the basis of which any prediction, in fact, can be made at this point of time. Absolute finally, if you look at the pandemic, the way the pandemic, in fact, has happened, you see the main challenge of the pandemic, as we all know, they're manifold. One is that they have exposed the fragility of the health infrastructure. they have also, very rudely awakened us to the fact that our priorities were all wrong in many cases. It's also possible that this pandemic, in fact, is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, I mean, so we have not paid attention to to ecology, to climate, to the environment, and as a result, in fact, it's a kind of a perverse revenge of nature. Okay, against gross anthropocentric abuse, or abuse made by men, let's say, against nature. So all these possibilities, in fact, they hang in the balance. But what I draw your attention to the fact is, and obviously there is this great economic, downturn. Okay, I mean, with economists, in fact, broadly predicting that this would not really result in a recession, but would possibly get us into a depression. Okay, possibly even a worse depression than the one which history, in fact, had witnessed. And economists, in fact, do not know how to come out of it, because the conventional and the traditional recipes may not necessarily work. Okay, but then let's not discuss that. I'm not an expert on economics, so I would not really be able to pick on this very I would say authoritatively. But what I draw your attention to the fact is that the pandemic is essentially it's essentially a political challenge. Okay, and we have to understand it in its fullness. And it is a political challenge because it involves the possibility of further strengthening ultranationalist forces, securitizing emergency powers, deglobalization, and increasing recursive border practices, all of which in fact would ultimately lead to a constellation of political forces that would be regressive and clearly eat away the sinews of whatever remains of the liberal international order which exists. In other words, what I'm saying is this, that look, the way in which the pandemic in fact has moved, it is very clear that the pandemic in fact has extolled in some way or the other the benefits of nationalism and statism. Even if you look at the European Union, okay, which it has the strongest multilateral practices, that one can see in the world, but they also really couldn't really do much. So you witnessed medical nationalism in virtually every European state, everybody trying to save their own people. This fear of your own people, the fear of the stranger, which doesn't really have to be somebody who's of a different ethnic stock. The stranger comes now from very much within. But once the pandemic is gone, the old references of the stranger, the old references of the other, in fact, possibly would hark back. The arrogation of emergency powers, so whether it is in Hungary or in Brazil, in some other places. So what you find, in fact, is that these are very disturbing political scenarios, and the whole idea of social distancing, in fact, is antithetical to the idea of politics. Politics is about bringing people in, it's about engagement. Politics is essentially about collective decision makings, where people, in fact, would have to come in and express themselves. One can understand the fact that this physical distancing, in fact, is a medical necessity. But there is also the possibility that this medical necessity, in fact, is an opportunity which the ultranationalists and authoritarian political forces, in fact, might take advantage of. And if that happens, then the future of the international order, in fact, is definitely imperiled. My point is that we are in the cusp of a very delicate balance right now, and it is not clear which way the wind, in fact, is going to flow, which way the wind is going to blow. There is still some life left in the present international order, but it's been struggling for a while. And if the new challenges which the pandemic, in fact, have thrust on it are not responded to in a manner in which they need to be responded to, then there is every possibility that over a period of time, a new international system would gradually take shape. I don't think that new international system, if it does take place, is going to be a better international system than the one in which we live today.